Welcome to everyone. Thanks a lot for joining us for this evening, for this very special final event of Écran Total. Just a quick word to introduce myself. I am Amandine Alessandra, professor at the École de Design and co-curator of Total Screen with Marine Baudrillard, Carole Lévesque, Katharina Niemeyer, and Magali Hull. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Quebec in Montreal is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as a custodian of the lands and waters on which our event takes place in Tiohtià:ke, also known as Montreal. The exhibition Écran Total, or Total Screen, was curated for and shown at the Centre de Design, which is based at the University of Quebec in Montreal. This was the first time that Jean Baudrillard's photographs were shown in Canada. His images, as well as his thinkings on the concept of virality, simulation, surveillance, and implosion, were revisited in the light of the latest developments of our relationship to screens, especially during the pandemics, with pieces by Adam Basenta, Charlie Doyon, Clint Hans, Mishka Henner and Vassim Bhatti, Penelope Umbrico, and Chuanye. In conjunction with the exhibition, a series of international conferences, roundtables, and workshops took place in 2021 to critically explore the different roles and forms of screens in our daily social and cultural practices. The exhibition and conferences are available on the website écrantotal.ucam.ca and were also featured at the Venice Biennale of Architecture in 2021. The exhibition is now accessible in virtual reality from wherever you are with a headset on écrantotal.ucam.ca. So, in the name of the organizers of Écran Total, Total Screen, and as a co-curator of the exhibition, I have the pleasure to introduce this final and closing event of the Total Screen Symposium, a conversation with Sherry Turkle. Before introducing our special guest of honor, I wish to thank all the partners who made this event possible. This includes the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, the Centre de Design at UQAM, the Centre de Recherche Culture Art Société, the Faculté de Communication, École des Médias, École de Design, Faculté des Sciences Humaines, Département de Sociologie, Association Cool Memories, CRISIS, le MAST, le Lab CEMO, and the Biennale of Architecture in Venice from 2021, and the research group Art, Letters and Numbers. I also wish to thank our technical assistant, Jean-Philippe Saucier, and the 4 interpreters, Anissa Mustafa, Pamela Burchell for American Sign Language, and Alice Dulude and Mathieu Larivière for the interpretation American Sign Language to Quebec Sign Language. So please, if you ask questions later, please remember to speak to keep your flow slow and your questions short to facilitate the interpretation. You may also wish to ask your questions in French in the chat and we can translate it for you if you feel uncomfortable to ask it in English. So please let me introduce our guest speaker to our international public who is watching us from Brazil, Mexico, Italy, Canada, Bulgaria, Germany, just to name a few places, as well as the 2/3 discussants. Let's start with Sherry Turkle. Sherry Turkle is the Abby Rockefeller Mose Professor of the Social Studies of Science and Technology in the program in Science, Technology, and Society at MIT. She is also the founding director of the MIT Initiative on Technology and Self. Professor Turkle received a joint doctorate in sociology and personality psychology from Harvard University, and she's a licensed clinical psychologist. Professor Turkle writes on the subjective side of people's relationships with technology, especially computers. She is an expert on culture and therapy, mobile technology, social networking, and sociable robotics. So profiles of Professor Turkle have appeared in such publications as the New York Times, Scientific American, and Wired magazine. She has been named Woman of the Year by Ms. Magazine and among the 40 under 40 who are changing the nation by Esquire magazine. She is a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Rockefeller Humanities Fellowship, the Harvard Centennial Medal, and she's a member of the American Academy of Art and Sciences. Katharina Niemeyer is a media theorist, professor at the School of Media of the Faculty of Communication at the University du Québec à Montréal. She's a director of CELAT UQAM, which is the Centre de Recherche Culture Art Société, and she's a co-curator of Écran Total. Ola Zibert is a doctoral candidate at the Faculty of Communication of the University du Québec à Montréal, and a student member of CELAT UQAM, Centre de Recherche Culture Art Société. She is also the scientific coordinator of Écran Total. Now I will hand the microphone over to you, Katharina.
Thank you so much, Amandine, for this introduction and the introduction of the final event for Total Screen, which is quite an emotional moment, I guess, for all of us. Also those who are in the audience who have participated in the event since May last year. So thank you so much. And I'm very happy that Sherry Turkle is with us today. And when Professor Magali Öl, who's somewhere in the audience, suggested to invite Sherry Turkle to Total Screen, I immediately said yes with an exclamation mark. Because Sherry, you were one of the first authors we were invited to read in 1999 at the Bauhaus University in Weimar during a seminar and workshop where we tried to develop a virtual seminar with media theorists, programmers, and designers. And of course, our virtual seminar at this time had only basic functionalities and was far away from what we are doing now here right now with Zoom and teaming, teaching and online, etc. And all of what we wanted to do at this time in 1999 wanted to do in our minds is still not possible today, which is maybe also a good sign. Anyway, your book, The Second Self and Life on Screen, influenced the way we thought and developed the avatars of our virtual seminar, as well as the aesthetics and functions of our software. And as you know, and many persons in the audience, your work had and has a tremendous influence on media scholars, and in general on scholars in the humanities and social sciences, but also the general public. I think you're one of the authors who's read by a lot of people who are not working or researching at university. And Empathy and the Pandemic, and where we will come, Empathy and the Pandemic, and I think we will come back to that later also. But empathy flows and goes by screens. And there was also this, what happened to the exhibition and the symposium Total Screen that has been planned since 2018, and that had put into another angle how we think on screens during the pandemic. And your work, Sherry, on screens and off screen was more important than ever, also in our thinking of how we prepared the exhibition. But let me begin with a personal and simple question. We prepared the question with Ola Zibert. You can also see on the screen a very simple question in relation to the Empathy Diaries, so your most recent book and memoir. I hope you can all see it on the screen. So in your previous books, Sherry, you were exploring the life on screen and technology. So Sherry, who writes, does not share much about herself. There are small fragments about your daughter where you, for example, provide some descriptions about how differently she related to social media, etc. But there's nothing much about your own past and personal experiences. So what pushed you into writing a memoir, a very intimate and private piece where you share many frequently painful and emotional memories about your past? And why did you choose the title, actually, of Empathy Diaries? Thank you so much for answering this first question, Sherry.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's just a wonderful context for me to talk. I admire you all so much and feel so at home here in your project. But let me get to your first question. All through my professional life, I've felt very deeply that my work was not just a job, that I was connected to this story of bringing empathy into technical work, of looking at technology through the eyes of a humanist and a psychologist, and saying, if empathy and human connection does not live in our technology, there is a problem. If social media is undermining empathy, there is a problem. That was not just my job. That was, in a very deep level, my calling. And I felt that that story of how my scientific work, how my professional work was in fact my calling, was something I owed my readers, was something that I would have wanted to read. Because I think that the story behind the story of why people are drawn to their life's work is really what connects people to science, to research, to understanding in a deeper way what we read. And in this case, the connections were so, it doesn't devalue my life's work. On the contrary, it explains why somebody like me, sticks it out for thousands and thousands of hours of interviews, not always fascinating, for 40 years of following the story. And I really wrote the book for myself, to tell my story as honestly as I could, with all the documents and letters and emails and, traces I could find of how I came to my life's work. And the Empathy Diaries is called that because I realized that my need for empathy, because I had not been shown it as a child, but I needed to understand the motivations of the people who loved me and yet lied to me and showed me no empathy. I needed to develop empathy with them in order to not go crazy. So it was the combination in my own life of love and lies that made me become an empathic person in the quest for understanding what had been at the root of their lies and their wanting me to lie, etc. So I needed to share that with my readers.
Yeah, thanks. It gives another view, and at the same time, it's so visible actually in your narrative and the way you write. The passages actually from your personal life and all the disappointments you described, that a lot of emotional disappointments, but then that finally maybe made you who you are, the empathic, sorry for my English, this empathetic person who in the end gives it all back into research and with the children. So this is quite well explained and makes it clearer at this point, and it's also in the narrative. So I think there's something about this also, to finding maybe the feedback somewhere else, and sometimes when we cannot get it at home. And I guess we are not alone here saying this. It's a lot of scholarly work. I guess it's a bit like this at Family Deception. So it's very nice that this little universal part also was on your book and came out like that. And what makes us all also researchers who have emotions and empathy most of the time, I guess. And I hope. So thank you for this first answer.
I think the point is that empathy is not just something that you are given. It's something that you feel for others as you try to understand what your situation is. It goes both ways. Empathy isn't just give me. It's that I became the detective of my life. And to understand my life, I had to learn to be empathic with others. And once you have that experience, you learn to have greater compassion for yourself. So empathy for others is a very healing experience, because then you can show it toward yourself. And I try to make that point in the book, that it's not altruistic. You get a lot back when you show empathy toward other people.
I know that it is quite clear in the book, but also in relation to communication theory and media history, you show quite clearly how empathy can also travel via different media, but maybe we can come back to this later. And I know that Ola has a question she wants to ask you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sherry, for being here. It's actually about your detective skills, if I may say so. So one of my most favorite fragments in your book is about how you being inspired by Nancy Drew's book. You were looking for hidden objects. You called them mysterious objects to decipher in your neighborhood. And there is another one where you talk about the memory closet in which your mom and grandparents stored different photographs, books, and papers. So I wonder if you could just maybe read for the audience this small fragment for us.
Yes, I will. I found it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I was armed with a powerful idea. To be good at a job, you had to love the objects associated with that job. I found this idea in a book that Milton, that's my stepfather, Milton, had brought home from work. How to Choose the Right Job for You. The book explained that if you love hammers, wood, and tools, think about being a carpenter. If you enjoy tidying things up in files, think about office work. In other words, imagine yourself with the objects of your craft. My mother relaxed by walking through the fur and evening gown departments at downtown department stores. It was natural that she should think about being a nightclub singer. I loved fountain pens and beautifully bound notebooks. I could see myself as a writer, like Jo March in Little Women. That we owned a book about career choices was unusual. We had so few books at home. Milton had his biography of Abraham Lincoln. I cherished an illustrated edition of Cinderella, and my grandmother had bought me Little Women and the 24-volume Funk and Wagnalls Encyclopedia. The volumes were released once every 2 weeks at her local A&P supermarket. Our largest collection of books was my stash of Nancy Drew mystery stories. My half of the pile of books tied up in neat parcels that my best friend Helene and I had found in the incinerator room of our apartment building. This was the way books got passed from family to family in our building. Most of the families in the building didn't know one another, but had similar backgrounds and incomes. They were Jewish and worked as civil servants for the post office, as waiters in delicatessens, struggling to be in the middle class. We knew a family where the husband was an accountant, and we viewed them with awe. These families did not have extra cash to buy books for their children. My grandmother's gift of Little Women and the encyclopedias was a special treat. When it came to books, we all used the public library. There were 2 public libraries near Murdoch Court, one a half-hour's walk, the larger one a short bus ride away. So for Helene and me, finding a pile of Nancy Drew was dizzying. There were 19 volumes. Helene had made the discovery and summoned me to the incinerator room, so she got to keep 10 and I got to keep 9. In order to solve her mysteries, Nancy was often called upon to decode an object, a brass-bound trunk, an old clock, a pair of twisted candles. Some of the objects had hidden compartments or secret drawers that would suddenly open. I searched my neighborhood for mysterious objects to decipher. One stool at the soda fountain was a different height from the others. It could be a secret compartment. One fall, Helene and I put on our Brownie Scout uniforms and roller skates and pretended we were Nancy Drew Girl Scouts, deputized by the FBI. We asked neighbors to tell us about any suspicious activity. My mother was mortified. I told her I would stop, but I promised myself that I would find mysterious objects outside of Brooklyn.
Thank you so much. I really love this fragment. It's also a bit personal for me because I was doing exactly the same. I was digging. I was not stealing, but I was hiding objects in my garden and then digging them up and pretending I made huge discoveries. So somewhat it's a bit personal, and I wonder how you reconcile this creative, nostalgic pursuit to understand your own identity and your studies of technology, screens as tools and objects. So there are, I feel there are two Sherrys in the room, one which is very nostalgic about her own identity and the one who focuses on technology.
Well, I don't really see myself as nostalgic. When I was writing this book and looking for elements of my past to write about, the book may read as nostalgic, but I was actually quite analytical in choosing the elements of the past that pointed directly toward my methodology in the future. So nothing is included as a bit of my past that really didn't speak to who I would become later. So the notion that objects and the deciphering of objects, the twisted candle, the mystery of Larkspur Lane, the Fabergé egg that springs open and has layers of meaning when you open it, all of Nancy's objects in every book, the brass-bound trunk that has a secret compartment, all of Nancy's objects. When I look at a computer or a new software system, or when I first looked at the operating operating system of a Macintosh, what struck me really was it was a Nancy Drew moment, because I thought, this is an operating system that is completely opaque. Unlike the DOS operating systems that had come before, it does not open itself out to the user to get layer upon layer, transparent layer after transparent layer to get you back to the operating system underneath. This wants you to stay at the surface and see only the simulation. So all of those years thinking about objects and their structure really was preparation for a kind of fascination with decoding how objects appear to people. And I see the link as quite direct in my own fascination with how technology presents itself to us. So I came up with a phrase: we were encouraged with the Macintosh to take things at interface value, which is really right out of my Nancy Drew life. You know, it's taking an object at interface value, as opposed to the early computers, which came with instructions for how to get to the operating system underneath. The early computers were objects that taught you how to get at the innards of the computer. With the Macintosh, with the introduction of the Macintosh, you were told to stay on the surface of the computer and really to move into a culture of simulation. And I hope this is an answer that begins to, to get at the real question you're asking, mm-hmm. which is, how does a lifetime of thinking about objects prepare you to look at new objects? And I feel that is very much why I included this story. It's not out of nostalgia for my life as a detective. It's particularly to talk about a lifetime of fascination with objects.
Yes, and it's actually, it makes a lot of sense now when, you know, when I read your memoir and then your previous books. Now the image makes, like the whole image behind your detective story, and also how you treat computers and screens, that makes a lot of sense. It's more pursuit of your how you want to understand the simulation of the computer and how they represent themselves.
Yes.
to people who
every screen is
them.
not equal. Just because it's on
Exactly.
a screen does not mean it's equal with everything else on a screen. That is one of the big, you know, false representations when people talk about hours on a screen. It depends what you're looking at on that screen. It makes a big difference.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for this answer, which goes a bit back also, which is coming up all the time in the book about the materiality of media objects. And I might ask a question of someone who's in media theory at some point, but who's especially also interested in old media objects. I put old like this because these objects do not really die. But I was intrigued by a lot of extracts and passages in your book. But there is one which finally it's perfect that you are talking about objects, because it's the Xerox room, which is in the book. I just show it again. I think it's on page 246. But that I would like to invite you just after to read like a bit of it. But what was so fascinating for me about this whole Xerox chapter is that first you combine something there which is really interesting. It's all your first experience at MIT from 1976 up, the buildings, and of course the loud thinking part. I enjoyed a lot how you describe it, because it makes it so imaginative to see the Xerox room and the loud thinking. And then this chapter brings also together your experience in France and meeting Lacan. Also the interdisciplinary potential of your future at MIT, and even more so because you're talking about the different levels in the building. So the material of the object is always there. So it would be very nice to share this short paragraph too with the audience. Yes, page 246, that would be nice.
My pleasure. By early spring, this is the spring of 1976, I had thrown myself into writing a short proposal to the National Science Foundation to study the, quote, social and psychological impact of computers. I brought my work to Harry Hannum. He was the dean of the School of Social Sciences and Humanities at the time, who had recruited me actually to MIT, not particularly to do this, by the way. I brought my work to Harry Hannum, who helped put it into better, quote, proposal form, since I had never written a proposal before. And by a Sunday in late April 1976, I was ready to make copies so that the dean's office could distribute it for administrative signatures on Monday and then send it off to Washington. When I got to building 20, that was the building at MIT that I worked in, the Xerox machine in the dean's office had run out of toner, but Hannum had given me his code for the DSRE Xerox room. So the DSRE was the Division for Study and Research in Education, which had educational researchers and AI scientists working together. And so they had put me in there as like an extra thing, just so I could meet, you know, new people. So I had gone to some meetings there. He gave me the dean was in charge of this Xerox room. And since his Xerox room wasn't working, he gave me the code for this other Xerox room so I could get my proposal Xeroxed. And I made my way down there. I found Seymour Papert in that Xerox room. Seymour Papert was a very distinguished computer scientist, and expert in developing computer languages for children. I found him in that Xerox room, photocopying last-minute proposals of his own. As I waited for him to finish his copying, we spoke about the connection between free association and psychoanalysis and loud thinking. He was doing a project on loud thinking. He said that he was trying to make more transparent our resistance to learning, inspired by how psychoanalysis makes more transparent our resistance to certain memories and feelings. And he was trying to borrow the non-judgmental tone of the analytic relationship. In a loud thinking group, a speaker should be respected, never judged. He wanted a supportive, open space. We talked about how Jacques Lacan fit into all of this. I said that when Lacan talked about psychoanalysis as a space of complete intellectual freedom, that's how he talked. But my dissertation depicted the Lacanian world as quite judgmental. You were in or you were out. Seymour nodded. What is this proposal? Seymour finally asked, looking at my papers. For the first time, he seemed to register that I was there for any other purpose than to talk to him as he used the copy machine. I told him that I had been struck by his work with children and computers, the idea that the computer is an object to think with for thinking about mathematics. Papert was teaching children, even very young children, to program in a language he had helped to design. He was on a mission to convince educators that while in 1976, children could only meet the principles of computer science in his laboratory, very soon inexpensive small computers would bring programming to children everywhere. As a clinical psychologist, I told him I wanted to know about children's emotional attachments to these machines, because computers crossed standard cognitive and emotional categories. They were in some ways like Freud's uncanny, something that seems both familiar and deeply unfamiliar. One minute you think the computer is like a calculator, but then it does something that makes you consider it as almost alive. One minute people were referring to the computer by saying things like garbage in, garbage out, and the next they were wondering if someday a computer might be their best friend. For me, that made the computer a perfect example of an evocative object, an object that opened up your thinking to other things. This idea was what was keeping me at MIT. Thank you.
Thanks for this, and which quietly is like connecting with the first question and empathy, and now we can see it how you related it to the object of the computer, and I think we will also come later back to this with Ola. Don't worry, I won't ask a question about Lacan and psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
I think it's not the moment to do this. I will. I'm more interested in this part of your in your chapter. You combine really eloquently different life experience levels in your narrative. I really appreciate this from a literature perspective. But I would like to know, especially for the PhD students who listen to us, how the fact of you being a woman, that was really something for me in the book. I was like, how being a woman in this world of mainly male MIT shaped your career at some point. So how did you experience and live with this? Sometimes you talk about it in the book. You evoke it quite often, that you are the only woman, or quite often alone as a woman, but you don't make an explicit story within the story out of it. So how did you find your place, Sherry? Sherry's place in this world of May 68 in Paris, and finally in this scientific world of man, from Lacan to Seymour at some point, if I may say. Yeah, so maybe there's some advice also to give, like for the younger students who listen to us.
Well,
yeah,
there are many.
It's a personal question too,
yes,
but it's a bit
fine.
implicated.
It's fine. I say a lot about this. Well, first of all, I should say that a little piece of this that I didn't read just for time, because I didn't want to take up too much time, is in the same chapter, I mentioned that after this conversation, I say something like, and I fell in love with him just like that. So by the end of this couple of hours in the Xerox room copying my proposal, I say to the reader, and I was in love with him just like that, which is true. And I later married him, and I was in love with him just like that. I mean, it was the coup de foudre, as they say. And the things did not, the marriage didn't last. It was a deeply troubled marriage, but I regret nothing of it. It was a deeply, it was a very gratifying and important marriage. And, you know, so one thing was that being, you know, in this one occasion, being the only woman in the room, and among 3,000 computer scientists who were men, you know, brought me a very deep love. But more seriously, I was so, and I'll tell a story that I think is the most telling, actually. I was so socialized into expecting to be treated like an administrative assistant, or in those days, we didn't even say that, we said secretary. That there's a story in the book when Steve Jobs comes to MIT.
Yes, I remember this part.
Yes. Okay, so I explained Steve Jobs is coming to MIT, and the Apple II had just come out, and he was treated like a god because he had had a fundamental insight that the computer could be beautiful. It could be something just different. It wasn't even the Macintosh yet, but he saw that the computer could be really something that people would want in a different kind of way than they wanted a big clunky IBM PC. And it was clear he was working on new stuff that was exciting. And in a way, I had that insight because I was studying the computer as this object to think with, as an object in the culture, as an object of love, you know, I don't want to say that Steve Jobs and I shared, you know, this vision, but in a way we did, of seeing the computer as other than a tool. And I was not invited. Well, I was a professor. I mean, I wasn't an assistant or a research assistant, I was a professor. I was not invited to any professional meeting with Steve Jobs. I was invited to cook dinner for Steve Jobs. And I tell the story of cooking dinner for Steve Jobs in the book. Mm-hmm. And I describe, actually, it's very funny how I was told it had to be a vegetarian dinner. And so I cooked this elaborate vegetarian dinner, and all these famous computer scientists come. Steve Jobs walks into the dinner, and I have all this elaborate vegetarian food around. He looks at it, and he looks at me, and he says, "That's the wrong kind of vegetarian," and he walks out. So that's, you know, I failed at making a successful Steve Jobs vegetarian dinner. But what's very telling is that during the entire experience and during the entire writing of the book, I did not notice enough to say to my reader, note that I wasn't invited to meet with Steve Jobs. So the best answer to your question is to say that not only was I not invited to have a meeting with Steve Jobs, but that seemed so natural to me as I told the story of this time, and I put myself into that time frame as I wrote the book, that I didn't even comment on it in the paragraphs about that meeting. In other words, there's no snarky me that comments on it as I wrote that. I just say I was asked to give him a meal, and I was really sorry they didn't like my meal. But there's no kind of snarky Sherry Turkle 2021, 2022 that says, isn't it amazing? Or isn't it effing amazing that I wasn't asked to give him, that I wasn't asked to go to a meeting with him? And what does that show? So mostly my being a woman was kind of put me on the outside of this evolving culture in that kind of way. On the other hand, it allowed me to say, I'm on the outside of your culture, so I'm kind of irrelevant to you. And I'm studying something that's irrelevant to you. I'm studying your emotional connection with your topic. So do you mind my interviewing you and taping you and asking you all kinds of questions about this thing that's irrelevant to you? And everybody said yes. So I feel as though the true answer to your question involves my marginality as a never invited to the party, never invited to the meeting, not invited to meet with Steve Jobs. But on the other hand, being able to walk up to JCR Licklider and say, do you mind if I just interview you about your emotional connection to technology? And there I was, a woman, a psychologist. He felt no threat. He could unburden his heart. I think it was part of the same kind of relationship. I think my marginality worked against me and for me. I think that's the honest answer.
Thank you. Is there anything you would like to tell today to Steve Jobs?
Yes, advice. Well,
in this context.
Well, he was right. His insight. But in terms of it, there's a part in the book where I don't get tenure. In other words, this is not an ideal. This is not an ideal combination for getting tenure, because I'd written 2.5 books. I came up for tenure, and they were inconvenient books. I mean, they talked about very fundamental ways in which the engineering culture was not looking at very, very important elements of what computers were doing to the culture. It was an inconvenient message. And, I don't want to go into the details, but they found a way to deny me tenure. And at that point in the book, I stop and I say, here are some rules for women who are trying to get tenure in an academic institution. Some rules you should follow if you possibly can when trying to confront sexist institutions. And I give I give 3 or 4, kind of go-to rules for making your life a little bit easier. One of them is that do everything you possibly can to fight the fight, not on the basis of gender. If you possibly can find, because it's very unusual that the institution has really opened themselves up to it just being around gender, because they've usually used gender as a way to do some other outrageous thing. Because institutions just don't, they don't work that way. They're not so stupid. They don't say, oh, let's just, she's a woman, let's just make sure she doesn't get tenure. They usually have, made a variety of moves that have made it very, very hard for you to do your work and have been unfair to you, and go after those. Because in my case, they create, in order to not give me tenure when really, I had done everything. Honestly, I had just overperformed. They had made up a rule that I had to be not just in my department, but in another department. They had made up a rule at the last minute of something I needed to do, which was clearly like in terms of labor law, it was really kind of iffy. Like at the last minute, they changed the grounds for my employment, which they wouldn't have done if they hadn't wanted to make sure I didn't get tenure. And I kind of went in and I said, look, I don't think I'm going to sue you because life is too short. And, you know, I just don't think that would be a good use of my time. But I'm going to go to the New York Times with this new rule that you just you know, put in just for my case, which is even though you hired me under one set of conditions, now you're bringing me up for tenure under another set of conditions. And how many men have you done this for? So in other words, it was, you know, I found something that really didn't have to do with sex, with gender, just something that they just happened to do just before my case came up. And I had tenure the next day because it was so egregious. And there's usually, I must say, in the cases that have come up since that I've looked at in the country, there very often is one or two or three things that the institution has done that are something like that. And to go for those first, so you're not just coming in with, I was a girl, I was a woman, you know.
Yeah, at least you didn't have to cook dinner for your tenure. So.
Well, yeah, but, exactly. And if I come in with, I was asked to cook dinner, I never went to meet with Steve Jobs. Yeah, as opposed to you made me cook dinner, you didn't let me meet with Steve Jobs. Yes, that's yes. So.
And in retrospective, it's quite sarcastic if you look how computers and all the marketing around computers evolved so deeply and more into the questions of emotions and our emotional and sensitive relationships with computers. But just said like this, I think you were visionary for that in your time. So it's still in connect.
It's the same thing that they didn't want to. What's ironic is that the thing that I was pointing out was the thing that they were that so anxious to deny, that computers were tapping into our emotional life. And every time I said that, they said, no, it's just a tool. No, it's just a tool. And the message that I was giving, that it's not just a tool, was exactly the thing that they did not want to hear. But it's exactly the thing that's changed the culture. But you have to think about, why was this such a subversive message? Because it is such a subversive and ultimately a dangerous message.
Exactly, and this brings me directly to make the transition to Ola, when we were thinking about the last question together, and still in connection with the quoted paragraph, but because in the last part about computers as an evocative object, you just said it earlier, brings us to the ambiguous relations we might have with machines and screens, between anthropomorphism and rejective or passive attitudes. All this discussion also we have in media theory and sociology of media. So with Ola, we had another question related to this very visionary statement of the 70s that came out in the Xerox chapter. And Ola will make the follow-up for our last question in the conversation.
Yes, thank you. So by the end of your book, and I will read now the citation myself, sorry, you write, to fix our crisis of intimacy and privacy, of empathy and human connection, we don't need more apps, we need one another. And this is a phrase on page 342. So we wondered, during COVID pandemic, the sentence sounds even more unattainable, and this is a bit pessimistic view. On the other hand, screens and technology help to remain in touch during these difficult times. On yet another view, on another hand, more and more we talk about the impact of screen on mental health, what you also did in your previous books, like Alone Together, where you saw this impact on mental health of many people being in a virtual world. So I wonder if you have an idea for a technology which would be a more social or empathetic technology that could truly serve us, because this is also what you write in your book, in your memoir, that we need a technology that would serve us and not that we would be objects of this weird relationship that we have with computers. And
Right.
I wonder how this technology would look like according to you.
Right. Well, I was very distressed. This is a great question to end on. I was very distressed. There was an article the other day that quoted me in the New York Times right after the pandemic started. And it quoted me, the article said, there used to be a debate about screen time. Guess what? Screens won. And it quoted me as saying, I was wrong, you know, screens are good. Look how they're helping us during the pandemic. And it was taken really out of context. I was basically saying that, you know, which made me think I should never talk to a journalist again. I mean, basically, I was saying that when we lost the ability to see each other face to face, thank God we had Zoom. I mean, I remember Passover coming and I couldn't be with my family. Thank God I had Zoom. Now, I'm not taking that back, but I also am not taking back that after that Seder was over, I cried. You know, I'm just, you know, it wasn't the same. It wasn't the same. And the Zoom weddings and the Zoom bat mitzvahs and the Zoom bar mitzvahs and the Zoom reunions and the Zoom, I mean, thank God we had them, but let's not kid ourselves. So, you know, I think we have to just have a kind of, I was not suggesting that we should develop a technology that will be a substitute. What I envisage is a technology that will help facilitate our connections in the real. Technology that will make it, I mean, what people are suffering from is that they literally do not know their neighbors. They are not getting, children go to school, and now more than ever because of COVID, not knowing how to do the dance of eye contact, of empathy, of asking about someone else, of getting into harmony with someone else's body, of the mirror neurons firing up and being able to mirror parallel play and asking for someone and checking in and the things, the dance of being human. So we need to use technology to bring us together with other people in more, in the flesh, in face-to-face interactions. You know, whether it's reconstituting, you know, we've let so many of our institutions, the library groups, the flower groups, the political, you know, the political groups that were little groups that met to talk, the many groups that met to do neighborhood projects, the religious groups, I mean, the locally based groups that used to just enjoy meeting. People shun groups where they will have to talk face to face. People experience face to face interaction as stressful. And, you know, I've just been going through my papers and trying to put some organization in my papers. I have thousands of hours of interviews of people saying how they find face-to-face conversation stressful. They find telephone calls stressful because, as one person said, it puts you on the spot. I mean, not one person, many people, but the one person who I'm quoting says, it just put me, she feels on the spot. She has to say what she feels on the spot, as though that is intolerable. To have that feeling of someone waiting for you on the spot in a telephone call. Whereas in a text and an email, you have a chance to review and revise and curate and put forth your best self. So we have to get back to becoming fully human in this other way, because this rigidity, my students don't want to see me in office hours. I am like famous. And they don't want to come to office hours. They want to send me a text and I will send them a text, or they want to send me an email and I will send them an email, because there's the fantasy that they can be perfect in their question and I will be perfect in my answer. So this is a long answer to a short question, but I'm trying to give you a sense that I'm not looking for a new technology. I'm looking for a technological portal to bring us back to each other in person. We are the empathy app, is how I like to put it.
I think that's a really thank you for this answer. It's really telling, because of course I know people who prefer to communicate through Facebook Messenger or Zoom or whatever, but there are also people who there are also students who are really tired with online classes. And for example, myself, I much prefer face-to-face contact, but of course it depends on a person, depends on a personality, and it's also telling about generation, the difference between generations, right? I mean, you prefer face-to-face contact, whereas younger people who are used to, they were brought up in the spirit of communication, they prefer communicating as they were, they are used to.
Yes,
so,
but we have to stop thinking of it that way. I mean, I'm really quite, is that this is not, there are skills. I think the people who were older have to stop saying, oh, well, other generations were brought up differently, they prefer. You know, there are skills, there are human skills that they don't have, that they need to learn to be fully human.
Yeah.
And saying
that weren't, that
no,
weren't
no.
developed.
That weren't developed. And that it's not their fault that they didn't get a full chance to develop them. And because, and unfortunately, the pandemic certainly didn't help, but also that their parents and, you know, were on their phones too. And they didn't say, okay, dinner, no phones. You need to learn to read my eyes. You can't be on a phone. You need to fight with me. You need to learn how to have a fair fight. You need to learn to have a fair fight. My students come to see with me in office hours and they put their heads down. Even if I don't let them have a phone, they don't know how to have a fair fight. If you're talking about ideas, you need to have a fair fight. We're not fighting about, you know, we're fighting about Baudrillard. You know, fair fight me. I mean,
exactly.
You know,
no, thank you so much. It's very nice to hear this answer. Also, as a mother of a young child who needed to be put sometimes in front of screen for me to learn. But I thank you for this answer.
Yes, and we could fight about Baudrillard at some point. Don't know what happened. If with the spotlighting, maybe it's myself. I know we're coming back. Jean-Philippe is behind the scenes taking care of that because we need the interpreters, please. So we just wait a while. That gives us a breath to take. Jean-Philippe, do you find everyone? Good. Because I wanted just to make the bridge to Amandine. And we might fight about Baudrillard, but this is another question we can discuss later. Well, I think we're all back. Yeah, great. Thank you, Jean-Philippe. Thank you very much, Sherry, for sharing and to go a bit deeper into your memoir. I mean, there's never enough time to do so, but I just wanted to say that Amandine will be moderator of the question and answer session. And also I wanted to make a thanks. I forgot to put it in the script, but now I think about it, about all our colleagues who read your book actually since December, I guess, during, I guess, the holiday break. So different colleagues from the Faculty of Communication at the Université du Québec à Montréal, but also from the CELAT, Centre de Recherche Culture, Art et Société, the Lab CEMO, also the CRISIS. It's not Krise, but CRISIS, so, Research Center on Communication, and the colleagues also from Total Screen who participated in the exhibition. And sorry if I forgot, I don't want to take so much time, but they had already read your book, and I think there are a lot of questions coming up from them. So with Ola, we will disappear on the screen, but still be there. So we will be not alone together, but together. And yeah, so Amandine, thank you for making the following up.
Thanks a lot, Sherry. That was really, really insightful. And thanks, Katarina and Ola, for conducting this conversation with such great questions. I hope you all enjoyed this really amazing presentation. So now we will take some questions or intentions of questions that we were sent during the conversation. But it's not too late to send any questions to me in the chat. First of all, we had one from Nadia Serayoko. Would you like to ask your questions, Nadia? We need to spotlight you. Sorry, yes.
Hi, well, first of all, thank you so much, Sherry Turkle, to be here with us. And thank you for the organizer. I'm so excited to meet you. Though it's through Zoom, I would like to meet you in person, but that's okay. I've seen your work, and I have to say that I've read even your earlier work, and I present them to my students because I really like the contrast, and I see them more and more, identifying with that position of getting back in presence, some of them at least. And when I read your memoir, I sort of saw it as an autoethnography, because I went into it and I started to take notes of all the times where you added little notes in between what was your souvenirs, your memories about the works you would be doing later. I remember here, page 92, you say, "I don't talk when my vulnerability feels like too much to bear." When years later I met internet user who told me about the pleasures of hiding behind screens, I understood what they were trying to say. And so I saw this as like a sort of a two-part reflection, first on how we build our identity, and these little subjects start to come up, the things that we are going to later be studying. And then in the second part, as how your identity continued developing through the research you were doing, and how you were answering these questions that you had as a child and as a young adult. Would you sort of like, do you have like interest in autoethnography, and do you see that that type of work applying to your memoir?
You have exactly the right interpretation of what I was trying to do. I was doing I was doing what I do to others to myself. I was taking myself as my ethnographic subject, and I was prefiguring, look, this woman understands why it's nice to hide. I understand, Sherry Turkle, why it's nice to hide. So when later I meet a whole culture of people who are telling me why they like to hide, my attitude toward them is not judgmental. It's not, oh, you shouldn't hide, that's bad, you should. I'm more than compassionate. I'm truly I really understand, but I also know all that you don't get out of life if you hide. So I'm trying to use a woman who struggled against her personal limitations, but who understands the pull of those limitations. Like, for example, there's a whole section of the book about my grandparents as they weren't Holocaust survivors, but they experienced life as though they had been Holocaust survivors. I mean, I'll never forget when somebody knocked on our door, or when a workman came to work in our apartment. My grandmother sat with her pocketbook on her, fully dressed, with her pocketbook on her knees, clutching it with her hands like this. In her mind, she was dressed as though they were going to take her away. There was an echo of the Shoah in her body language. And when later I met Holocaust survivors and people whose lives were limited traumas like that. You know, I left Brooklyn and could start a life that was relatively free of anti-Semitic peril. But that was so etched in my soul that I never feel dismissive of people who experience that, even unconsciously. And sometimes at night, when I close the door to my apartment, I feel in my body my grandmother's, now I'm home, now I'm safe, as though I do experience this transmission of trauma that only when my door is closed is there something. I feel my grandmother's body in my body, because I know how when she closed the door, she would close her eyes and sigh like she made it back. I don't think that ever goes away.
No, and I think that when we read your memoir, we see that in the first part, how as a child, that identity about being Jewish was through the family, you know, to the family tradition, to what they were experiencing, to the experience that people they knew had and that they transmitted to you. And then in the second part of your memoir, I felt like you name things differently. Like you talk about, you know, being from a Volosian origin right. in Minsk, and suddenly it takes a different, it's sort of like it's maybe it's a more intellectual construct, but it also still is connected to the emotion of eating bagel and lox and all these things.
Well,
you know,
I think in the second part, I'm trying to figure out what to do with all of that in this new context, because I am still, that's why I say that even now, when I close my door, I can feel that emotion of the Nazis haven't come today.
Yes.
I'm home. You know, so I feel, you know, and I think in recent political events, when all of a sudden right-wing authoritarian regimes are coming up on Fox News as like heroic in this country, I am like, you know, I am incredulous and frightened and freaked out, and, you know, and look around me to who else is watching this and is thinking that it's okay for right-wing authoritarian regimes to be okay, you know. So, you know, I think that it was very important for me to write that story as I really experienced it almost in my body, and as I felt it in my family's body. You know, I wanted to balance the memoir so it wasn't just my childhood story, but I tried to bring it through. I did try to bring it through.
And I have to say, it really reconnects with all your works, where usually that experience through the body is what differentiate, you know, like what we can live through an avatar, through an AI or something.
Right.
Because these feelings, that experience that is really like embedded in ourselves, it is not transmitted through sensors or to anything else. It's still cut from.
Thanks, Nadia. Sorry, I have to cut. It's very hard because it's such, I'm really into the conversation.
I know.
Also
Thank
very
you so
emotional,
much.
so I feel very dry,
so
but we asked you lots of questions.
Thank you so much for the question.
Thanks a lot, Nadia. That was really a good question. Now I've got Selina Vandenbroek, who has a question. If you want to. Hi, Selina.
Hi, merci d'être ici avec nous ce soir. It was a pleasure reading your book, not only because it is a page turner, really, but because we rarely get to have access to how personal histories or feelings and intellectual parcours shape one another. So thank you for sharing the story behind the story, like you said. There are many narratives in this book that appear at the beginning and then only make sense later on. And one of the things that returns all the time is the issue of silence, how you grew up in a family where certain issues were surrounded by silence. And these silences were heavy with meaning, and you became proficient in decoding them, which in turn shaped your ability to put yourself in other people's places. And I wanted to ask if these silences that were so integral to the way you grew up shaped you as an academic and also maybe as a mother. I was wondering how you passed on or taught this empathic ability to your students and also to maybe to your daughter. Thank you.
Great question. Well, the book is an argument for speech over silence. I don't say, hey, this book is an argument for speech over silence, but that could have been its subtitle. Start talking. My last book was called Reclaiming Conversation, so I couldn't call it that again. But basically, the lies are toxic. The lies were toxic when I was a baby. They were toxic in my childhood, and these toxic lies that my mother had me enact really undermined our relationship through her life. And in some ways, this book was my attempt to reclaim, among all the other work that it had to do, it's my effort to reclaim my relationship with my mother and say, okay, now I understand why you enforced this silence. Now I see you did it to protect me. Yeah. Now I've tracked down the man whose name you didn't want me to say, and I see that he frightened you and you wanted to protect me from him. So now I understand, but I wish you could have talked to me. And I felt after I finished the book that you read, because I think you read the hardback, is that right? It has a white cover.
Yeah, I read this one.
Yes, yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. After I finished that book, the book is coming out in paperback at the end of March. And they asked me, well, there are a couple of little mistakes in the hardback that maybe you didn't catch, a little semicolon here, or, a little wrong name there. I could add one paragraph at the end of the book. And I added one paragraph at the end of the book in which is the acknowledgements, in which I say, I'm adding an extra acknowledgement for my mother, because I think that in the book as a whole, I mention it, but I don't stay with it. The credit I give her, because when she found out about the experiments, that this is a spoiler alert for anybody here who didn't read the book, buy the book. Very good. That when she found out the experiments my father was doing on me, she didn't tell her mother, her sister, her father, and her eventual next husband, because she was so ashamed and so frightened that knowledge of these experiments would blow up her life. She thought that even a rabbi, I found out, had told her that it would make me unmarriageable because I was the child of somebody who perhaps was mentally defective. And in Jewish, in Hasidic Jewish land, that would make me unmarriageable. So she kept that secret. And I was the only one who found out about it when I actually met Charles Zimmerman. And I paid tribute to her in this paragraph that I paste at the end of the acknowledgements to the paperback, saying that when I reread the whole book with some distance after it had come out, I realized the debt that I owed her and the weight that that secret must have been to hold that secret all her life. And really that secret gave me my life, because had she not left him, I think I really would have, you know, no healthy child could have grown up in that place. And it was an extraordinary moment for me to have come to that after writing the book.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sherry, and thanks, Elena. I think we have time for one last question, if we keep it short before we conclude. We have a Chiara Piazzesi. Sorry, Piazzesi. Sorry, Chiara.
No problem. Thank you so much, Sherry Turkle, for this wonderful conversation and for sharing these beautiful memories and these beautiful insights. If you allow me, I wanted to take you back to something that you said before and intrigued me about a list of good advice that you gave or you provided for women colleagues who would find themselves in the same situation you did. And you mentioned that one of the maybe the first one was not to make the claims and demands about gender. And I was wondering if you would give the same advice today to women colleagues, whether anything has changed that makes you think that today we can name the problem, we can name gender injustice as being the problem, being the cause of so many problems that we are, so many challenges also and obstacles that we are experiencing as women in academia. Thank you.
I want to say yes, better to name the problem. So I'm going to speak out of two. I want to say yes, better to name the problem and better to get your allies on the problem with you, because it's gender injustice. In my institution, I think if the gender injustice has manifested itself in a way that will mobilize people who don't care about gender injustice, politically, that will be very helpful to you. Because this way, people who genuinely don't care about gender injustice will fight for you. Now, there are some people who disagree, who say if you don't name the problem and fight for gender injustice, you're not advancing the cause of gender injustice. My feeling at MIT has been that I have done more to fight for gender injustice by winning that case and fighting for gender injustice for the next 45 years than saying you're getting rid of me because I'm a woman. They would have gotten rid of me I would have lost. But times have changed. There are now offices that are just as, they're just there to help people fight for gender injustice. But I think my point is that it's so easy to say, my gender injustice has manifested itself in X. And the X is something usually so egregious that people who don't care about gender injustice can ally themselves with this egregious thing that stands apart from gender injustice. So in my case, I feel that gender injustice was very much a part of my case. But they had to express the gender injustice by doing something that people who wanted no women at MIT had to say, you can't change the labor, you can't change her terms of employment on the day you want to fire her. You have to keep her. People who wanted to get rid of me because I was a woman had to be on my side. So this tip is not to argue against fighting for gender injustice. As you can say, I believe that this was done to me because of gender injustice, but let's not talk about this. Do you want me to report to the New York Times that you changed the labor rules on the day of firing? Is that your look? Is that the MIT look? And faced with that, it's absolutely not, we can't, no, that was a mistake. So I don't mean to deflect your question, because your question goes to the heart of progress, but it goes to the heart of how to make alliances. You know, I'm trying now in our political situation to figure out how to make alliances with people who don't agree with me at all. And I'm trying to figure out how to make common cause with people who don't agree with me at all. And it often is by not fighting about the thing about which we don't agree, but by trying to find the thing where really we do agree. So my tip was to keep yourself hired and play the long game.
Thanks, Sherry.
I hope that's okay. I hope that's my honest answer.
Thank you, Sherry.
But I can be swayed. I can be swayed to the other position. So I respect the other position a lot.
And thanks, Chiara. We're going to take one last quick question before we conclude by Serge Prou. Are you still here, Serge?
Yes.
Good evening.
Okay, attendez, mon micro. Okay. Yes, okay, it's a pleasure to meet you, Sherry, because I read, we are the same generation. So I read I read your first book in the year 1984, and so I'm pleased to try to converse a bit with you. I have so lot to say, but I will just concentrate because I think I just have 1 or 2 minutes. But I read your last book. I read your diary from the first page to the last page. It's for me it was passionate book, and I feel that I know you. It's incredible because we never met, and I feel I know you. I entered, you know, and like when you described the Brooklyn life of a Jewish family, it was great. It's fantastic, and the idea, not the idea, but the main theme who cross out your book about the name of the father. It's for me it's a case study about the name of the father, because I read in Lacan that idea, and now that I look at your book, I read you. It was so pregnant, and I realize I did not before understood really what Lacan meant, but now with your book. But my question was about, you know, it's a thing, it's an idea you exchange with the Seymour Papert in the famous Xerox room about the relation between psychoanalysis and artificial intelligence. It was about the idea of a decentered self, and so I understand what we can say about the decentered self in terms of artificial intelligence, but can you say a bit more about how the psychoanalysis can give us some hint about the decentral self?
Oh, absolutely. I think that I wrote since my answer has to be short, since I see the time, let me just say that I wrote extensively about this in an article in Daedalus called Psychoanalysis and Artificial Intelligence. I think it's either called An Unholy Alliance or Strange Bedfellows, or it's kind of like, but it's about psychoanalysis and artificial intelligence. You just have to type in, and it'll be right there. And I think actually one of the articles I wrote about this was co-authored with Seymour Papert. I'm not sure if it's co-authored, but he's definitely mentioned as an influence in it. We had many conversations about this, which is that the Freud is roundly criticized in the French tradition of psychoanalysis, in the object relations tradition of psychoanalysis, in everything except the ego psychology or tradition of psychoanalysis, which was very popular in America, for positing a kind of homunculus in the ego, which served as a kind of little mini me, an I that fought off the id from below and fought off the superego from the top, and served as a kind of unified self that integrated the self, and really was like having a little homunculus where you didn't have any problem with there being a unified self that was your consciousness. And that notion of Freud has been roundly discredited by sort of every major European tradition of psychoanalysis, and increasingly, whether Kleinian or French or, existential, or really from around the world. And even in America now, there's very little American psychoanalysis that continues in that very unitary self mode. And the problem for psychoanalysis now is how to think about, the integration, to take object relations theory of a much more decentralized notion of the objects that we internalize, the experiences, the people, in psychoanalytic terms, people are called objects, objects are called objects. We internalize these experiences to make up something that feels like a whole, that we experience phenomenologically as a whole and a one. Now that problem of how to have many, many programs operating in a program, and yet have the program operate as a one, is a problem in artificial intelligence. And so the dialogue between artificial intelligence and psychoanalysis, which is what I tried to point to there and what Seymour and I began our conversation about, is really a very rich conversation, and one that I think analysts and AI people are increasingly interested in having. I don't believe that you can ever create a person from computers, or a person like, but you certainly in both cases can learn a lot about how, by studying AI, you can learn a lot about what kinds of models of integration of disparate structures can work together to form a coherent one, which is the problem for a sophisticated psychoanalytic model.
Thank you so much.
Which has to move away from, well, there's a little person in your head. There's not a little person in your head.
Thanks, Serge, and thank you so much, Sherry.
I think we have to finish because of the hour, because I would like to pursue, but
well, there's a lot to discuss. There's a lot, obviously, to discuss.
Thank you.
Yes, I wish we could pursue, but we will lose our interpreters in a minute, and that won't be fair. So thank you again so much. Thanks, Serge, and thank you so much, Sherry Turkle, for answering those questions, for presenting your book. the Empathy Diaries. It was really an honor to have you with us for this closing event of Écran Total. It's been really, really insightful hearing you talk about your personal journey through the Empathy Diary, especially at a time when screen mediation tends to put our empathy at stake. Thanks a lot to you, Katharina Niemeyer and Ola Ziebert, for coordinating this special event. And thanks to Jean-Philippe Saussier for your technical help, and to our brilliant 4 interpreters. I hope you coped with our speed. Anissa Mustafa, Pamela Burchell for American Sign Language, and Alice Delude and Mathieu Larivière for the interpretation, American Sign Language to Quebec Sign Language. So this concludes the webinar on Sherry Turkle's Empathy Diary. The conversation will be available on our website soon, so that's ecrantotal.ucam.ca. Thank you all for attending. We hope you have enjoyed this and have a nice evening.
Thank you.